Hey, my name is Ryan and I can pull my forehand the length of the field. In this video, I'm going to teach you the 8 secrets to distance for forehand throws. In order to set a proper grip for ultimate Frisbee, you can simply create a pistol shape, and the things we're looking for are fingers against the rim and no space between the edge of the disc and this little crotch in your palm. So you don't want to hold the disc like that. You want to hold it like this, with your thumb biting down on those flight rings and your fingers tight against the rim. And when I say lock your grip, what I'm referring to is reaching around to the other end of the disc and pulling it that way so that your wrist gets back and any space gets eliminated. And that way you're in a great position to throw hard. I like to use 3 fingers, so give that a try. You might find there's a little bit more power there, but I think for most people, 2 is the way to go. Just make sure to grab onto that rim, pull everything back, get yourself set up for a good throw. I see a lot of beginning players start out with a comfortable sort of shoulder width stance, and they get used to throwing that way because in warm-up and in the park they're always kind of just standing in a less athletic position, and then when they start to throw with more power they kind of lose balance. So the way to compensate for that is to get a wider stance, whatever feels powerful for you. The problem is when you got that wide stance, it's hard to rotate. So what we're gonna have to look at next is how boxers put out cigarettes to loosen up those hips. So now that we've got our wide stance, we need to be able to rotate. And in order to get used to how that rotation happens, we can look at how boxers turn their hips in order to generate power. And to do that, boxers are trained to take their back foot and put out a cigarette, just like that. So if you have a cigarette, you throw it on the ground, you've got this rotation on the ball of your foot. Now that same rotation carries through when you twist into a punch. You can see that back foot turns. So they want to see this hip turn, back foot pivot, put out the cigarette, like that. In Frisbee, it's actually, for me, because I'm right-handed, it's going to be my left foot. Now that I've got my wide stance, that's my pivot foot, right? So to put out the cigarette, when I'm getting ready to throw, I gotta get that heel up off the ground, and I'm putting out the cigarette there. It's almost as if I'm throwing a punch that way. Now that I'm turning my hips, I'm getting ready to throw some more power from my hips. So remember, put out the cigarette with your pivot foot. Now that our hips are rotating well and we've got good pivot action happening from our pivot foot, we're gonna start a big wind up from our shoulders, and that's going to load up all of this force in preparation for a long throw. So try to get your back facing upfield. During that wind up, get your elbow high. And this is going to be a familiar position in other sports too. If you think about baseball, that elbow isn't going to be down here, it's up here. And that's because we're creating a lot of space for that elbow to travel during the actual throw. So if you look at a starting position for baseball, the backswing in golf, high elbow every time, even like starting a punch, the elbow's high up. It's the same in Frisbee. We want to have a high elbow. It's not crazy high, but bring it up about shoulder height. From here, we're going to lead with our shoulders. You'll see I actually throw my arm out across my body. It's kind of like this counter force that whips my body around. So when I'm throwing long, this arm swings out. You got to be mindful if someone's in front of you marking, you have to sort of keep your arm tight, turn your shoulders, snap your hips, and I really find it helps to lead with my elbow. I really visualize leading the throw with my elbow out front, and that starts to cue good mechanics for that forehand to come through powerfully. So I've got my high elbow to start, my heel is off the ground, I'm starting to snap. Weight is on this foot, almost all of my weight is on this foot. Rotating, keeping this elbow forward and tight, it's not too far out. Bringing it through and getting ready to actually release the disc. Now this next detail is actually the very most important part of throwing long, and that is taking this edge of the disc and making sure that we release it down here. We've got to drop that edge, and that's because when we throw really far forehands, really aggressive, powerful forehands, the disc is going to want to turn over in the air, and that's because this edge is traveling against the air. It's receiving more resistance, and more force is actually generated as lift under the disc. So to compensate for that extra lift on this side of the disc, we have to release it at a fairly exaggerated downward angle during that really far forehand throw. So this point is huge. Drop that outside edge during your forehand pull, just like that. I've actually created a training video, which I'll link to right below this one, and it'll teach you how to scale up your dropped outside edge throw until you're actually just throwing the length of the field. You can scale up your throw with that skill alone. So check out that training video and you'll learn how to really generate distance by dropping that outside edge. At that point of release, start to think about your thumb as if you're a hitchhiker and you're trying to get your thumb pointed at the ground. And the reason for that is when we start to add more force to the throw, there's a natural human tendency to want to let your wrist roll over, and that's because in every other sport, baseball, if you're throwing a football, you actually snap your wrist and you let your wrist turn. However, if you do that in Frisbee, if you snap your wrist and let your wrist turn, the disc is also going to flop over in the air. The way to get rid of that floppy turnover disc in the air thing is to release the disc and then picture your wrist externally rotating, trying to get your thumb pointing at the ground. So in this point, you're releasing the disc, and even after releasing, you're trying to maintain that wrist shape by pointing your thumb at the ground. During the entire throw, think of your spine as your axis of rotation. So I'm rotating on this type of axis around my spine. I'm not upright turning around my spine this way. It's tilted like this, but everything is pivoting around my spine. My spine is more or less stationary in space, but I'm thinking about not really moving around too much in space. I want my spine to be this straight axis of rotation, and that way I'm able to generate more speed because there's no wobble in my spine at all. It's very straight and it's twisting like an axle. Bang. Now all of those principles apply to throwing long with a pivot foot established when you're throwing out around a mark. But when we're throwing a pull to initiate a point, you can actually perform two hacks that are going to make your throws a bit farther. One of them is you can throw more across your body this way because there's nobody marking you. In a game, somebody's marking me here, so I can't throw as much across my body. That's where they are. So I actually have to contort my elbow to get out and around them. When pulling, I can actually cheat a little bit. I can turn my body sideways and I can really throw across my body. And the reason I do that is because I'm stronger this way than this way. And if you think about the mechanics of that, if I'm standing in a doorway and I have the door frame here, if I resist against that, it's going to be really hard to push the doorway with any degree of force. Whereas if I simply turn my body and push like this, I'm going to be generating a lot more force here than I can here, and that's because my pectoral muscle is weaker in this position, stronger in this position. It's more contracted. So tip number one for throwing longer pulls is release a bit more in front of you and less beside. The next big tip for throwing longer pulls is to take an explosive crossover step. And I'll record that in slow motion so you can see what I mean, but by launching into a crossover step, you actually run into your throw and you get more snap as soon as your foot plants into the ground. So those are my tips for increasing forehand distance. If you want the full blog, read the whole thing. You'll get a lot more detail and clarity on how to increase the distance of your forehand. And I can't stress this enough. If you haven't already tried out the Ultimate Frisbee forehand training video, click the link below and get that video, because honestly, with a little drill that starts out like this, you can scale that up so that your forehand goes like this. Wow, so far. I almost put that in the washroom. So again, click the link below, click the video below, click the link to the video below and get your forehand scaled up. Let's go.